Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and with me is Aware's favorite Republican, Ed Mendel. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, July 16th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. Today is the anniversary, in 1945, of Trinity, the first nuclear test explosion carried out near Alamogordo, New Mexico. It was the culmination of the Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb, directed by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The first detonation of a nuclear device conducted on this date was part of the Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb in the course of the Second World War. As Robert Oppenheimer witnessed that first detonation of a nuclear weapon, a piece of Hindu scripture occurred to him. Quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Close quote. It is perhaps the best-known line from the Bhagavad Gita. Oppenheimer is rightly seen as the father of the atomic bomb. Quote, "We knew the world would not be the same," he later recalled. "A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent." Oppenheimer, watching the fireball of the Trinity nuclear test, turned to Hinduism. The Bhagavad Gita is a 700-verse Hindu scripture, written in Sanskrit, that centers on a dialogue between a great warrior prince called Arjuna and his charioteer, Lord Krishna, an incarnation of Vishnu. Facing an imposing army containing his friends and relatives, Arjuna is torn. But Krishna teaches him about a higher philosophy that will enable him to carry out his duties as a warrior, irrespective of his personal concerns. This is known as the Dharma, or holy duty. It is one of the 4 key lessons of the Bhagavad Gita: desire or lust, wealth, the desire for righteousness or dharma, and the final state of total liberation or moksha. Arjuna asked Krishna to reveal his universal form. Krishna obliges, and in verse 12 of the Gita he manifests as a sublime, terrifying being of many mouths and eyes. It is this moment that entered Oppenheimer's mind in July 1945. Quote, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One," close quote, was Oppenheimer's own translation of that moment in the desert of New Mexico. In Hinduism, the great God is not only involved in the creation, but also the dissolution. In verse 32, Krishna speaks the line brought to global attention by Oppenheimer. Quote, "The quotation, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds,' is literally the world-destroying time." Oppenheimer's Sanskrit teacher chose to translate world-destroying time as death. Irrespective of what Arjuna does, everything is in the hands of the divine. Quote, "Arjuna is a soldier. He has a duty to fight. Krishna, not Arjuna, will determine who lives and who dies, and Arjuna should neither mourn nor rejoice over what fate has in store, but should be sublimely unattached to such results. And ultimately the most important thing is he should be devoted to Krishna. His faith will save Arjuna's soul." Close quote. But Oppenheimer seemingly was never able to achieve this peace. Quote, "In some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatements can quite extinguish," he said 2 years after the Trinity explosion, "the physicists have known sin, and this is the knowledge they cannot lose." Close quote. If you take a look at recent history since the Second World War, something really remarkable has happened. First, human intelligence created two sledgehammers capable of terminating our existence, or at least organized existence, both from the Second World War. One of them is familiar. In fact, both are by now familiar. The Second World War ended with the use of nuclear weapons. It was immediately obvious on August 6, 1945. It was obvious that soon technology would develop to the point where it could lead to terminal disaster. Scientists certainly understood this. In 1947, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists inaugurated its famous doomsday clock. You know how close the minute hand was to midnight? And it started 7 minutes to midnight. By 1953, it had moved to 2 minutes to midnight. That was the year when the United States and the Soviet Union both exploded hydrogen bombs. But it turns out we now understand that at the end of the Second World War, the world had also entered into a new geological epoch. It's called the Anthropocene, the epoch in which humans have a severe, in fact maybe disastrous, impact on the environment. It moved again in 2015 and again in 2016. Immediately after the Trump election, late January this year, the clock was moved again, late January of 2016, the clock was moved again to 2.5 minutes to midnight, the closest it's been since 1953. So there are two existential threats that we've created, which might, in the case of nuclear war, wipe us out. In the case of environmental catastrophe, create a severe impact, and then some. A third thing has happened. Beginning around the 1970s, human intelligence dedicated itself to eliminating, or at least weakening, the main barrier against these threats. It's called neoliberalism. There was a transition at that time from the period of what some people call regimented capitalism, the 1950s and 60s, the great growth period, the post-war expansion rebuilding from the Second World War. Thomas Piketty, the economist, refers to this as the Très Glorieux, the glorious 30 years, and the rebuilding, reestablishment of capitalism in the post-World War II period. But that all changed in the 1970s. That period of great growth and fairly egalitarian growth, too, with advances in social justice and whatnot, including the civil rights movement, all of that comes to an end in the 1970s. With the onset of the neoliberal era that we've been living in since. And if you ask yourself what this era is, its crucial principle is undermining mechanisms of social solidarity and mutual support and popular engagement in determining policy. All that's been moved backwards, set backwards. It's not called that. What it's called is freedom. But freedom means subordination to the decisions of concentrated, unaccountable private power. Freedom for large piles of money, in other words. The institutions of government or other kinds of association that could allow people to participate in decision-making, those are systematically weakened in the last 40 years. Margaret Thatcher said it rather nicely in her aphorism that there is no society, only individuals. She was actually, unconsciously no doubt, paraphrasing Marx, who in his condemnation of the repression in France at the end of the 19th century said, "The repression is turning society into a sack of potatoes, just individuals, an amorphous mass that can't act together." Close quote. That was a condemnation. For Thatcher, it's an ideal, and that's neoliberalism. We destroy or at least undermine the governing mechanisms by which people, at least in principle, can participate to the extent the society is democratic. So weaken them, undermine unions, other form of association, leave a sack of potatoes, and meanwhile transfer decisions to unaccountable private power, all in the rhetoric of freedom. What does that do? The one barrier to the threat of destruction is an engaged public, an informed, engaged public acting together to develop means to confront the threat and respond to it. That's been systematically weakened consciously. I mean, back in the 1970s, we would have talked about this. There was a lot of elite discussion across the spectrum about the danger of too much democracy and the need to have what was called more moderation in democracy, for people to become more passive and apathetic and not to disturb things too much. And that's what neoliberal programs do. Neoliberalism has been the fundamental policy of all presidents, including the last one, for 40 years, accompanied by its military equivalent, neoconservatism. Trump became president by attacking neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which you rightly saw were keeping America from being great, in the sense of the wealth and prosperity of the average American. But in office, he has adopted those policies: neoconservatism, meaning more war, and neoliberalism, meaning more inequality. President Obama, whose war policy Trump is now following, was the first president at war for 2 presidential terms. That's neoconservatism. Obama also presided over an accelerating concentration of wealth, now greater than it's been since the stock market crash of 1929, and that's neoliberalism. We will turn to our friend Ed Mandel now on an early indication of the 21st century populist wave that arose in response, however confused, to neoliberalism, neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Well, no, what I mean by that, Ed, is not a particular criticism of the figure you want to recall right now, but that to note that populism as a political movement criticizing the anti-popular activities of the American elite, indeed the elite in all the capitalist countries, is the movement. There's the general name for the movement that it produces everything from Brexit, the British absence from Europe, to the Trump presidency itself, as a criticism of these policies of the last 40 years: neoliberalism, more inequality, and neoconservatism, more war.
I don't perceive Trump as being the failure you perceive him as.
He's a failure in the sense that he has been, the policies that he attacked. He was the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack those policies. The policies that he attacked, he's now effectively adopted. And that the Trump administration, regardless of what they say, is doing essentially what the last administration did.
Anyway, the fellow we wanted to mention who passed away recently was Ross Perot. And for me, when I voted for him back in 1992, I rejected the Bush. I also rejected the Clintons completely. And so it's almost as if the businessmen have bracketed the Clintons' career. I mean, but I guess you could say that Ross Perot began their career and Trump effectively ended it. and for me, I perceive Trump as being more successful than apparently you perceive him as, if only because he's brought up the issue of fake news. And for me, that is very, very important. He is the first president in my lifetime to bring up that issue. And I think it's very, very important to bring it up because it's almost as if fake news has disguised the agenda that you. I know that you believe in the serious issue of fake news because you literally have quoted Chomsky by the news from Neptune.
Well, so news from Neptune is about fake news.
Yes,
I mean,
and
it sounds like it's from Neptune, and we're telling the truth.
So you actually consider the issue of fake news be extremely important, also, obviously. And I think that, I consider Trump to be the first president in my life to bring it up and mention it over and over and over again, and as an important issue. And right now, the news media is attempting to disguise it by trying to say our news media are honest, they're reporters, and they're trying to brand themselves as being above that and beyond that, and they aren't. as they continue to do it. It has nothing to do with liberalism. It has nothing to do with conservatism. Because as far as I'm concerned, fake news goes back decades. When I was in high school, it was called yellow journalism. It was referring to the Spanish-American War way back then. But then you could update it to the Tonkin Resolution. You can update it any number of times through the years up to the present day. So it's continued. So it's a certain continuity. So as far as I'm concerned, bringing up the issue of fake news is extremely important, and that's the reason why I like Donald Trump. I voted for him, and I probably will vote. Not probably, I will vote for him again, and when he runs again into the 2020. So and there's no question. I think he's far superior. Now I understand you're politically you're in a different way, and I understand you're probably going to vote for the Green Party candidate, and it's okay, and I can understand that. It's just that for me, it goes beyond certain economic neoliberalism. It goes beyond other things. I believe he has been successful in discussing this issue of fake news, and I think it's very, very important to bring it up.
I agree with you entirely on its importance. I also agree with you about the long-standing nature of it, and I'm even willing to date it a bit. Fake news refers, I think, in the largest sense, to the sort of media manipulation that American government and the political establishment of the United States found to be necessary back before the First World War. Through most of the 19th century, the American ruling class could control labor demands, could control racial demands even, other things like this, with force. That's what the Civil War was all about, after all. But the problem was, by the end of the 19th century, the United States found there was a growing popular movement. In fact, there was a literally named populist movement, a popular movement that couldn't be controlled by force because it was too big. Too many people were saying, we're getting fake news. They didn't use the term, but that's what they were talking about. And the U.S. government, particularly in the Wilson administration, before the First World War, decided that indeed we have to control this news somehow, otherwise people will get out of hand. And it was a quite conscious program in the Wilson administration. The Wilson administration set up a commission made up of major American intellectuals to control the news. They called it the Creel Commission, named for its chair, and their job was to make sure that the story got told the way the Wilson administration wanted to. Remember, they had a lot of back-turning to do in the Wilson administration. Wilson was elected in 1960 as the peace candidate. Exactly, you're right.
And then he led us directly into World War I. Yes,
that's the point.
Right.
That's exactly the point. Now, in fact,
that has happened over and over again.
It was the economic issues that was also was the original reason for being concerned with controlling the news. The labor unrest in America at the turn of the century, and the need to suppress that labor movement. When it couldn't be done just by sending in the police. It had to be done by propaganda. And the Wilson administration invented it.
Well, I guess the labor movement was in its early stages. They were
absolutely.
I guess,
Look at the U.S. has a bloody labor history in the generations after the Second World War. After the Civil War. In other words, the end of the 19th century, the golden age, according to American capitalist historians. But the point was that they couldn't repress this stuff. They had to control it by controlling the narrative, as we would say today, and that produced fake news. With Wilson being the champion of the new intellectual news regime. Wilson's contemporary, Rosa Luxemburg, the German who was murdered by a social democratic government at the end of the First World War, Rosa Luxemburg said, who was a revolutionary, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. And the point of American media control was to make sure that that story got told in a way favorable to the American ascendancy.
Controlling the narrative.
Exactly.
I would just say that again, to reiterate, I mean, for me, the media keeps on repeating over and over again as if it was an obvious thing that the 2016 election was stolen. And for me, there was no question that there was a certain continuity between Ross Perot and Donald Trump. I mean, there was no question. I mean, for me, it was an easy choice. It was an easy decision to make. It was not some sort of Facebook or Russian influence that encouraged me to do it. There was nothing at all. I mean, I rejected the Clintons back in way back in 2000 back in 1992 when they first appeared on the scene, and it was obvious. And I suppose from your perspective, neoliberalism obviously is not just a democratic thing. It crosses party lines and.
Absolutely.
I would offer to you that I perceive Trump as being at least from my perspective, virtually a third-party candidate.
I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, it makes it kind of strange that a third-party candidate elected in a major party, on the Republican Party, but I perceive him as a third-party candidate, which both parties are like having a problem with for different reasons.
I think that's exactly right. The whole setup that Trump overthrew was a setup in which you had two allowable positions, the Republican and the Democratic position, neither of which challenged the sort of control that the American ascendancy exercised over the whole country, and nobody else could play that game. What Trump did was come in and criticize those principles that the two parties were supposed to hold in common, and did it in such a way that he enthused enough people in the country to overthrow that system by electing a candidate who was not properly vetted by the political establishment.
I mean, during the primary season, they were mentioning over and over again that there were neoliberal and neoconservatives that were saying anybody but Trump, anybody but Trump. And,
right,
then, and as he kept on plowing his way through the primaries of 2015, 2016, he kept on winning, and it said, what the heck's going on here? And so, no, the conservatives were, at least not the conservatives, the neoconservatives, but they were constantly attacking him. And so he was being attacked from both sides. And so now, literally, I do perceive him as being like a third-party candidate.
I think it's an arguable position. Most people, I'm afraid, would not. If you ask 10 people on the street who Ross Perot was, most of them would remember. But I think you're right in seeing him as the
fulfillment,
first blossoming, in a certain sense, of the modern populist notion in the U.S. When he ran for president in '92 and in '96, in the various, he was a Reform Party candidate in '96, an independent candidate in '92. But what he was doing was manifesting this criticism, inchoate, unformed as it was, and it's exactly that which made Trump president. And there is a continuity there that says a great deal about American politics in general, outside of the careful either-or that we normally present it in.
Yes.
I think you're right.
I mean, I dare say if they had done a poll, which they never did, and they never will, if they had done a poll of all the people who voted for us back in '92, they would find that virtually 100% voted for Trump.
I think you're probably right.
And they went basically virtually, and I would go with 100%. It's like, whoa, isn't that rather strange? We're finally get 100% here. No, but I'm saying I think he was the kind of, there's a certain continuity between the two that they to think, well, a businessman, who's willing to see outside the box, and they were willing to see things outside, issues outside the box. And I think, anyway, I don't want to repeat myself over and over again here, but I'll just offer that. And one thing I'll tell you, I want to go slightly off issue. You mentioned about climate change. I mentioned the issue of climate change, and your thing. The only thing I'll offer to you right now is I perceive mankind as being part of the climate, if you will, rather than being apart from it.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important issue, because they keep on repeating over and over again that we are controlling the climate when we are a part of it. And when you're a part of something, it frames the issue in a different manner. And I don't want to get lost in the whole issue, right, in the discussion of that particular issue. I'll just say you and I disagree but apparently I disagree with the whole issue of climate change from that perspective. And I'll just leave it alone because I don't want to get sidetracked on that particular issue.
The coining of the term Anthropocene as a new geological age seems to me to suggest something that you're onto here, and that's the fact that the climate doesn't just exist out there separate from us. We're part of it, as you say, and we have an influence on a great deal of it. And what we've learned recently is how dangerous finally that influence is, how much of what we're doing could eventually destroy civilization as we know it.
I will disagree with you.
You say that's not possible, huh?
Well, I would say that what you're describing is not exactly what I would agree with. But I don't want to get lost in that particular issue. I'll just leave it alone. But I can understand you're obviously you started off the program with the discussion of nuclear war.
Right.
And obviously the destructiveness of nuclear weapons can have a major impact on the survivability of the world, as well as radiation and other issues like that.
Well, let's come back to that question of nuclear weapons and war making. My contention, the contention that we've been defending on this program, is that in fact Trump, for all his peculiarity, and peculiarity just in the sense that he's unusual,
Vulgarian or whatever,
Trump is not the problem that we face in this country right now. U.S. war making is the problem that the world faces, and that is
which predates him.
That's within our concern as citizens of a government we're supposedly responsible for. While we Americans are preoccupied with posturing presidential candidates, there's a lot of them this year, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel, that is by far the most feared government in the world. And that's not surprising. Our government is today making war, that is, killing people, in 8 countries, and U.S. war provocations against Russia and China risk a nuclear war. Although most Americans are not aware of it, the U.S. government is bombing Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, the Philippines, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. We're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. ongoing drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, including American citizens, on purpose and not by accident, and hundreds of children. This is true for all recent presidential administrations, but notably the Obama administration. More than 250,000 American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. The 70,000 U.S. troops in the Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities have included kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, torture, and murder. The U.S. is torturing the people of Venezuela and Iran, countries with large reserves of oil, in order to overthrow their governments, which aren't following orders from Washington. Comment?
Yes, I not specifically, but just the idea of, yes, you are correct. I mean, obviously, the United States has economically we dominate. I mean, apparently, I think I heard it recently said that California is like the 6th strongest economy in the entire world. So yeah, I mean, we just the whole economy of the world is distorted from our perspective. And I'll say that I'll also note the fact that apparently was a military industrial complex or whatever. Our military always needs an enemy. I'm wondering if this whole Russian collusion issue, this fake issue, would need to be brought up to create an enemy which we're fighting, which apparently, supposedly, it's influencing Trump. So because they wanted to get rid of Trump, whatever, because of reasons of power. I guess they want to be in control. But the idea of you mentioned these different issues that the United States is we're creating problems around the entire world. Yeah, I wonder if it's a need to constantly create an enemy to fight against, and this enemy is largely gone.
I think there's something to that. I agree with it in part and disagree in part. It was Colin Powell, as a matter of fact, as Secretary of State, who said after the fall of the Soviet Union that he was suffering from an enemy's gap. As it was before he was Secretary of State, as a matter of fact, it was while he was Chief of Staff of the Army. The point was that to justify the vast military structure that the United States has built up, you need an enemy. And if there aren't any enemies, those barbarians were a sort of solution, as the poet says, and that's a real problem. There's another aspect of that, though, and that's the fact that American foreign policy for more than a century has been based on trying to make sure that the American elite, the American economic elite, controls Asia.
Control minerals.
The objection to American control of Asia comes from any sort of move towards economic integration in Eurasia, and that's exactly what the Russians and the Chinese are now proposing. So in some sense, the enemy's gap has been filled by the threat of economic organizations which exclude the exploitation by the American economic elite of the rest of the world.
Controlling the minerals and controlling the energy.
That and the entire economic activity of that area.
Yeah. And maintaining it, yes.
So enemy's gap, yes, but unfortunately in the long term, instead of looking for a cooperative world enterprise, the American elite has made sure to try to suppress attempts to organize parts of the world that the U.S. wants to have open for its exploitation. Consider the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is a project by the present Chinese government to establish economic connections between Europe and East Asia, also including Africa, but by a seaborne belt of connections and the road across Eurasia. Now, you would think that the U.S. would say, fine, let us in on the deal. We'll be happy to work with that. But instead, the U.S. has done everything it can to put a monkey wrench in the works of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That's perfectly consistent with what America has been doing since the beginning of the 20th, since the end of the 19th century. That unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s, what was that really about? What was about was the question of who would have economic control of what we now call the Indo-Pacific. The Japanese Empire and the American Empire confronted one another in the Eastern Pacific throughout the 20th century, not just after 1941. The Pearl Harbor was not the beginning, but rather the culmination of the economic competition between the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which wanted to have control of that economic area, and the American control of East Asia, which goes back to the, quote, opening of Japan, when the U.S. forced an economic presence into Japan.
Well, I also got the impression that Japan was going through a major revolution of its own, coming with technology. I mean, their technology, they had an explosion within the early part of the 20th century. So, and unfortunately, one of the problems they experienced was they were in search of minerals. I mean, because apparently Japan was very, very weak. And I don't mean to get into a discussion of World War II, but they had a problem with minerals, and that's the reason. that was the reason why they were attacking other countries. I suppose to get the minerals that Japan lacked.
I think you're right, and remember that the thing that really precipitated the war
Yeah.
was the U.S. attempt to deny any access
Yeah.
to those minerals, particularly energy resources, oil, in Southeast Asia.
We actually lured them into a war, and then that's a whole, we can get into the discussion how even Pearl Harbor was fake, but that's a whole other issue. And I'm going to discuss right now.
Well, Pearl Harbor, as I say, was the result of this competition, not the cause.
Yeah.
And we can mark that because it makes sense to say it. But it's sort of like saying that the Civil War was caused by Fort Sumter.
Yeah, no,
it wasn't caused by Fort Sumter. The Civil War.
It was an excuse to get the light the match, to get the thing going. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, our contemporary situation is a little different because the U.S. won the Second World War.
Yeah, well, so-called, yeah.
Germany was eliminated by Russia, and Japan was eliminated by the United States.
Yeah, well.
And it was the result was that when the smoke cleared, Russia, which had been destroyed by the Germans, and Japan, which had been destroyed by the Americans, were no longer figures, and Germany, of course, was destroyed by the Russians. There was only one man standing, so to speak, in 1945, and that was the United States of America.
That's the narrative, yeah.
But and an awful lot of American history since 1945 can be interpreted in terms of successive American governments insisting on maintaining that position of domination. As George Kennan wrote at the end of the war, the U.S. had 6% of the world's population and 50% of its wealth. Mm-hmm. And the task in the coming years, said Kennan, is to maintain the disparity. Mm-hmm. And to maintain the disparity, the U.S. has been willing to kill an awful lot of people. Since 1945, the United States has killed more than 20 million people in wars designed to maintain that worldwide economic dominance. Wars in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, the Mideast, and elsewhere. That dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II is hard to hold on to. Mm. The rest of the world doesn't like being subservient to the American empire. But unless we understand that American empire was established by the Second World War in 1945, and that the American government since then has had as the bedrock of its foreign policy to maintain that domination in what's got to be a long-term losing proposition, because the rest of the world is going to rebuild, we have some way of understanding what successive American governments have done and the results in the rest of the world, why the United States is the most feared country in the world.
Carl, I'll just offer that I'll just say that the narrative you just offered us now is not perfect, it's not clean, and history is unfortunately there's some dark issues in history that are ugly, and I don't know. I'll just say, well, yeah. I don't know if I agree with your narrative 100%. I'll just say that, yeah, I'll just think we're doing the best I can here and trying to make it as clean as possible, but it's difficult. It really is difficult.
What it means is that, shamefully enough, the basis of American foreign policy today is to use, the current situation, is to use war and the threats of war to retard that economic development of Eurasia. The Japanese government is gone, but there are other governments who would like to have that same sort of control over in their own regions in Asia, and the U.S. is not willing to let that occur. We have, as Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the writers on American foreign policy in the last generation, pointed out, we have to prevent the rise of peer competitors in Asia. Peer competitors, that is, equals who can challenge in some ways the U.S. control of the world established by the Second World War. So what the U.S. does now is to use war and threats of war to retard that economic development of Eurasia, and that means today, of course, principally Russia and China, as competitors to American control of the world economy. Most recently, examples run from the U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe, which is the policy both of the last administration and the current one. It was Obama and Trump, and there's no daylight, as it were, between them. The policy remains the same. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government remains what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
I'll just offer up the hope that Trump is different from previous administrations.
That's what made him president.
And I truly believe that there is a difference between George Bush and previous Republican presidents and Donald Trump. So I think the media is trying to portray him as a certain continuity there, and it's not. There's definitely a big major difference, and I think that's the reason why a lot of people support him. There's a certain element that will support him and will continue to support him because they do see some daylight there. Which, and I don't know if your narrative is perfect. I don't know, but there is daylight there, and I'll just repeat that refrain, whatever. I don't.
Unusual thing that Trump did running for president was to criticize the war making of the United States, and not just because Hillary Clinton supported it, but to criticize the war making and to announce an anti-interventionist foreign policy. He said, we don't need to fight wars like this. People heard that, and they also heard him say, we're going to make America great again, and people understood that not as establishing foreign military control over military control over foreign areas. They heard it as reestablishing that prosperity that their parents had, the prosperity of the last generation. The notion that jobs were open to talent, that people could move up, and that this had not been happening in the United States in the era of neoliberalism. And that people were slow to recognize that because, of course, the media didn't tell us about it.
I think what happened is, as president, he discovered there was a giant spider web of diplomacy, of the things that had been created, treaties that were created before he became president that bound him down. You know, trying to trying to create a new policy is going to be extremely difficult. So trying to create a new policy and a new direction is going to be difficult.
Absolutely.
With the spider web of a huge spider web of treaties that were created before through history, and so I mean it's difficult. I don't know. I think apparently Obama had the same problem, but from a different perspective. But that's another issue.
Well, what I criticize him for is not living up to the things that he said during the campaign, that this is the real problem, that he appointed neoconservatives to important foreign policy positions. And
now he has Bolton, yes.
Yeah. He changed the economic procedures that people thought he would follow to make America great again, and became a president who was following essentially the same policies of Obama and the Bushes. I mean, I'm more concerned about Trump not living up to what people heard him promise that made him president, rather than what he actually said. It's the problem that we have in America today is that this supposed spokesman for criticism of 40 years of neoliberalism turned out not to be so in practice. I wish he'd do what he said he was going to do.
Well, I just feel I think that's probably the reason why they keep on saying he's incompetent or something like that, because he's trying to control the steering wheel. It's all over the road. But I just think that generally he's already accomplished something which is quite different than from the previous administrations, and I'll just leave it there. And unfortunately, it's not clean and it's not perfect.
In the meantime, though, we have the war going on. Our friend Kathy Kelly from Chicago, who I personally think is one of the 10 people that keep God from destroying the universe. Kathy Kelly, the peace activist, writes this week, intense fighting and hideous attacks battered Afghans throughout their country last week as negotiators in Qatar weighed the benefits and costs of a peace agreement that might stop the bloodshed. This was the war launched by the younger Bush 16 years ago. Yeah. In Kabul, At least 40 people, this we're talking about last week now, at least 40 people, including one child, were killed in a complex Taliban attack. Dozens of children whose school was partially collapsed by a massive car bomb were injured. Of these, 21 were hospitalized with serious injuries. New York Times correspondent Mujib Bashal posted on Twitter a photo of an elementary school child being carried into the Italian Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War in Kabul. Blood on his face, Bashal writes, describing the child, still in shock, still clutching his pencil. The same attack damaged a television station, a government facility, and an adjoining private war museum. Operated by Omar, the Organization for Mine Clearance and Afghan Rehabilitation, a group dedicated to the never-ending, often dangerous work of mine clearance and disposal, the War Museum houses ordnance and landmines used in Afghanistan during 4 decades of war. In 2012, young Afghan peace volunteers took me to see the museum, writes Kathy Kelly. I recall a small exhibit showing remnants of a United States cluster bomb. The remnants are called bomblets, and each cluster bomb consists of 202 bomblets. They resemble children's playthings, items that could be stepped on, driven over, or picked up by curious children.
Ouch.
The U.S. dropped 1,228 cluster bombs in Afghanistan between October 2001 and March 2002 alone. That's in the initial invasion of Afghanistan by the United States. The Afghan landscape is now littered by anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, which Omar is striving to remove where permitted before more Afghan civilians and children are killed. Research by the Mine Action Program of Afghanistan indicates in the first 3 months of the current year, 130 Afghan boys and girls were casualties of ERW, explosive remnants of war. That is, the bombs that the United States has dropped there. As negotiation inched forward, 2 Afghan government airstrikes, possibly using United States assistance, hit civilians, including 7 members of a family in Baghlan province and 4 civilians in a clinic in Madam Wardak province. This is this last week now. The Taliban, the U.S. government, and every other warring party in Afghanistan must be asked, how many more civilians, including children, are you willing to kill and maim? The second time I visited the Omar Museum was with my friend Martha Hennessy, writes Kathy Kelly. We were asked not to take photos, but Martha had already snapped a picture of a carpet carefully woven to illustrate several types of landmines Afghans should watch out for. The carpet was hung on a wall, but actual mines lie in the paths to be traversed by innocent Afghans. On the phone with me discussing the recent Kabul attack, Martha mentioned that carpet and reflected on the terrible carpeting of Afghanistan with barbarous ordnance. Martha now faces up to 20 years in prison for protesting the most barbarous and inhumane weaponry ever invented. In prison, by the way, by the United States government. Martha, a granddaughter of the Catholic Worker Movement's founder Dorothy Day, is one of 7 activists called the Kings Bay Plowshares 7, whose April 4, 2018 action was in accord with her deeply held beliefs that life is sacred and must not be taken in war. The U.S. naval base at Kings Bay, Georgia, houses nuclear missile-armed Trident submarines. Entering without permission, they hung banners, displayed crime scene tape, and poured their blood on the base grounds. They protested the U.S. preparations, far exceeding those of any other nation, to commit omnicide, really killing all, to carpet the world in fire and fallout, in the snows of a deadly nuclear winter, and in ash. For the past 15 months, they've awaited trial on charges of conspiracy, destruction of property on a naval station, depredation of government property, and trespass. They feel that U.S. readiness for war must be put on trial now or potentially never. Another of Martha's co-defendants has been a guest like us of the Afghan peace volunteers. Our friend Karma Trotta recalls a visit to the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War, an Italy-based hospital that treated many victims of the recent Kabul attacks. In 2014, we had visited the hospital to donate blood and met Jamshed and Farshad, young teens who had survived a suicide bomb attack on the United States military base in Bagram. They'd been standing outside their school, outside the base, when the attack happened. Farshad's leg had been amputated. Jamshed had lost much of his vision. We asked Michela Paschetto, a young Italian nurse, how they were faring. Quote, "Today was a bad day for them," she said. "Really, I don't ask so many questions," she continued. "It becomes too much." I didn't know what to say, Carmen recalls. I honestly couldn't think of a word to say. Carmen, Martha, and each of the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 will have their say, however brief, in a Brunswick County federal court on August 7th. Oral arguments will be heard, including several motions, as well as their belief they oppose the U.S. nuclear arsenal in accord with their religious faith. They have consistently opposed weapons and wars, and just as steadfastly served as members of Dorothy Day's movement their impoverished neighbors. They understand the wars, the omnicidal weapons waiting their use at Kings Bay, and the suffering of the U.S. poor as, in some sense, all part of a global war on the poor. Depending on whether we resist or acquiesce, grieve or complacently ignore, we ourselves risk becoming the tragic, perpetually dangerous remnants of war. That's from Kathy Kelly, who coordinates the group Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago and has worked closely with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. She has a book called Other Lands Have Dreams, published by Counterpunch, which I recommend highly. That's the situation, the real war situation, which of course you haven't heard about it on mainstream news at all, but the situation remains very serious indeed. The U.S. continues to kill people around the world in order to maintain its economic dominance, particularly in Asia.
How much time do we have? It's like 10 minutes ago. I was going to mention something else. I mean, right now, I mean, again, to change the narrative slightly to something else. But we are also on the anniversary of something else that happened like 50 years ago. The launching of Apollo 11. I don't know if that happened exactly 50 years ago on this date. Mm-hmm. And although
You don't think it happened though, huh?
Well, I think Stanley Kubrick did a wonderful job.
That's very interesting.
I'll leave that theme, which is kind of strange because my father actually worked on the LEM.
Uh-huh.
He worked at Grumman for several years, and where he worked on the LEM in Bethpage, Long Island, where I'm originally from the Long Island area. So I mean, as a son, I mean, I probably should say, well, he did a wonderful job. And unfortunately, I'm reading the actual everything I've read about it, and then just like, wow, the story is very, very, very strange. I don't know if again, this will go outside the bounds of this particular program.
My youngest daughter is a movie producer, and I'm sure she'll be interested in knowing that one of the greatest shows on earth from 50 years ago was put on in that fashion.
Yes.
I think I have to admit, Ed, that I think that that isn't so. But
okay, well, we'll have to agree to disagree on that.
Exactly.
On several other issues, and politically or otherwise.
The accounts like that are subject to the truth of what actually happened.
Okay, well,
and it takes some serious effort to try to establish that.
Yes,
and that's what you're doing. So
yes. Well, we'll have to agree to disagree.
In the last few minutes here, I'd like to say something about what's going on in Congress right now regarding the anti-intervention activities of the U.S. of aspects of the U.S. government.
Okay.
The House of Representatives passed their version of the National Defense Act last Friday. They in the Senate are gearing up to try to reconcile their respective versions to get something to the president to sign. Now, they're quite different. They're importantly different. There's going to be an uphill battle this year as the two versions of the NDAA are wildly different. The House version includes a lot of amendments to limit the president's war-making powers, and the Senate leadership broadly refused to allow this sort of amendment to be debated and voted on. And if the Senate's Republican leaders don't want to let the floor vote on these amendments, they're certainly not going to let the House version through. Many are considering the House amendments non-starters. It's not clear how the House Democrats are going to respond. Clearly, a lot of the House was very eager to get a chance to debate and vote on those measures, and probably aren't going to be happy if the leadership just lets the Senate strip everything out in the name of getting something President Trump will want to sign. Indeed, the House passage of these amendments was the only way a lot of these issues were ever going to get any hearing in the Senate. On top of that, sending it to President Trump over a veto threat would be part of the point of Congress establishing its own foreign policy autonomy using the power of the purse. Now, the shocking thing here, of course, is that this dispute shows President Trump's tergiversation since the campaign, because what these amendments do are trying to limit the war-making powers of the presidency, and that was exactly what Trump was talking about during the campaign.
He's trying to fulfill one of his promises. Yes.
Exactly. So keep an eye on this and see what happens. And
I just thought that the Democrats are primarily posed on trying to figure out ways of impeaching him or doing something to discredit him. So if he should be reelected, they would have they'd be ready to dive into somehow getting him out of office. Then I don't know, whatever, which is not going to work. That's all.
And it would seem to be much more logical if the Congress was actually interested in ending the war-making, as Trump promised during the campaign, to produce these things and to produce the NDAA with these limitations in it and send that to the president. But that's not what the Democrats are doing.
Right.
So, you've been watching Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scholarly, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. My thanks to Ed Mandel, our favorite Republican, for commenting today, and it's clear that the divisions are not what some people assume they are. They're more important than that. We rely on our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog, Digital Citizen, we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes to this program and others like it.
You'll be hearing from his lawyers. They're stealing. Go ahead.
Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly, by the way, by our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook and Ed Mandel for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.